Okay, I think we can now make a start. I've just put the record button on, so we're recording this lecture and the response. And it is my pleasure, my very great pleasure, to welcome everyone to the 2025 David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture. I'm James Williams, Director of the Centre for Visual Cultures here at Royal Holloway. And this is an annual lecture in honour of a colleague, friend, teacher, David Vilaseca, who died tragically in 2010 in London, 15 years ago. But this is the 16th iteration of the lecture. Unbelievably, the time has passed so quickly. But here we are again together, and I'm very much hoping that David's family will be able to join us. They haven't arrived yet, but I'm sure they're on their way. They've always been to our lecture, and it's very important that we can honour the memory and the intellectual legacy of David with his family. So I just wanted to say a couple of things before introducing our speaker. First of all, to acknowledge that this is a very exciting moment in our appreciation and more general international appreciation of David's work. This is a time, I think, when David's renown as a thinker, as a writer, is ever more soaring. There have been recent theatrical adaptations of his work, as well as in the pipeline a film based on his work. And I think that this is a chance for us to kind of take stock again, to re-engage with David's work. And this is what our lecture today will be doing, precisely that, re-engaging with David's early theoretical work, as I'll explain in a moment. In this vein, I want to announce something which I've wanted to do for a long time, but we were trying to work out some of the terms and conditions of this project, and that is the setting up of a David Vilaseca archive here at Royal Holloway. And I can announce that this is now set up. We're in the early stages, but it's very exciting for us to be part of this growing appreciation of David's work, in the interest of sharing it to a new generation of scholars, and for those who are interested more generally in David's work as well. Now, this is an archive project that's been in collaboration with David's family, crucially, and they've given us their blessing, but it's also in collaboration with Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge. Isaias Falno has been instrumental in this, who was obviously, as some of you may know, also a speaker of the David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture a few years ago. It's also in collaboration with the Institute Ramon Llull in Barcelona, and they are sponsoring a graduate student of Isaias's called Will Kirby, who in fact will be helping to set up the archive and providing an inventory of material that can be considered by the curators here at Royal Holloway for inclusion in the archive. And I want to just make special mention and thanks to Naomi Labens and Anne-Marie Purcell, the curators, part of the cultural team here at Royal Holloway, who have been crucial to the discussions over the months and in fact years around setting up this archive. So there'll be more news as it becomes more concrete, as we get a sense of material. And I'd like to invite everyone, if they have material that they'd like to consider contributing to let me know, and I can pass it on to the appropriate people in the library. And this is going to be an ongoing process, obviously, but it will be a unique resource and the first of its kind anywhere. And we hope very much that it'll be open to everyone, because it will be digitized. So it's in this vein, as I say, and at this moment, that we are very excited to have as our speaker tonight someone who is engaging, helping us re-engage directly with David's theoretical work, and in particular on Salvador Dalí. So I would like to introduce Dr. Alicia Kent. who is senior lecturer in comparative literature and Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American literature at King's College London. She's a leading specialist in literature and visual arts of the early 20th century, in particular the avant-garde and surrealism. So she really is brilliantly equipped to engage with David's earlier work on Dalí. She's the author of numerous studies of surrealism and visuality. I'll just cite two items, if that's okay, Alicia. I could cite many others, but just to give everyone a sense of your scholarship over the years. First of all, from 2003, Altered Bodies that Define Surrealism, La Révolution Surréaliste and Gazzetta d'Arte from 2003, an article, and a more recent chapter from 2012, Text-Image Relations in French and Spanish Literary Reviews of the 1920s and 1930s, which is very much your interest in intermediality, which I believe you will be also engaging with tonight. So it's a very exciting time for us to have you here. We're very fortunate that you are part of our re-engagement with David's work at this moment. The response will be given by Ruth Hemus, Professor of French and Visual Arts here at Royal Holloway and fellow CVC member. Then we'll have a Q&A immediately afterwards, and there'll be a chance for us all to hopefully engage with Alicia's lecture and some of the arguments and ideas you're proposing, Alicia, around David's work. I would ask you please to wait perhaps until the lecture and response are complete to post your questions or thoughts, comments, any thoughts, suggestions you have in the chat, and we can pick it up there. A couple of practical things. First of all, there is an alt text version of the lecture, which Alicia kindly supplied. We've been trying to put it in the chat. It doesn't seem to respond, and I've sent it out to a few people. If anyone would like the alt text version, please put your email in the chat, and I can send it to you immediately so that we all have access to text and image in Alicia's lecture. I'd ask you please to mute audio and turn off your camera during the lecture. I think really it's at that moment that I should now get to the core of our event, which is to invite Alicia to give her lecture. And it is with great pleasure I introduce you, Alicia, and your title, which is simply and complexly Dalís. Over to you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm really excited to give this lecture. Before I dive into my script for this evening, I'm just going to share the PowerPoint for tonight and hope that James have told me that that's working okay. James, can you see that okay?
That's all good, Alicia, yeah.
And if I just flick forwards, second. Yeah, that's worked too.
Yeah, it is. Perfect.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, so let me say my formal thanks then to Ruth and James for the invitation to present tonight's David Vilaseca lecture, memorial lecture, and really for gifting me the opportunity to read David's book on Salvador Dalí's autobiographical writings, and to be a part of this community of colleagues and ideas that this lecture and David's work represents. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. Thank you. Dalí is the apocryphal subject of David's 1995 critical work on his autobiographical writings. And I'll try to speak to this writing through my own study of one of Dalí's installations, Taxi Pluvieux, or Rainy Taxi, which was exhibited outside the International Exhibition of Surrealism at the Galeries Beaux-Arts in Paris in 1938, and was reworked several times before being installed in the entrance hall to Dalí's Theatre Museum in Figueres. Rainy Taxi contains multiple elements: a taxi, mannequins, costumes, snails, water, plants. Frogs were also planned but never included. Dalí also wrote an explanatory note to be pinned to the taxi. So there's an additional play between writing and art, which will also feature in my talk this evening. Vilaseca's The Apocryphal Subject is not concerned with either surrealism or the wars in Europe, which will be my focus this evening, though when they are mentioned, it's together and relates to Dalí's expulsion from the Parisian group in 1934 as a result of his obsession with Hitler. Dalí's exit from the group, of course, follows earlier divisions in the group, based on those who wanted to continue to pursue surrealism for its own sake, as spearheaded by André Breton, the leader of the group, and those who wanted the group to tie its artistic contribution to a leftist political position, like Louis Argon, who left the group the year before Dalí, but remained close to other politically engaged surrealists, for example, Luis Buñuel, Dalí's surrealist film collaborator. At the end of the introduction to The Apocryphal Subject, Vilaseca writes, Dalí transgresses all boundaries, political, cultural, and psychic. Most of Dalí's written corpus exists at the crossroads between Catalan, Spanish, French, and English, each involving both a national culture and an academic discipline. His artistic work stands halfway between high art and mass culture, and his identity also exists at the point of tension between the inside and the outside, me and my double, my fault and your fault, homosexuality and heterosexuality, etc. However, the fact that Dalí's attitudes, his personality and work remain often in conflict does not mean that he does not have very specific things to tell us about the work and constitution of subjectivity, or in connection with contemporary ideological and political debates. My discussion this evening will, I hope, speak to Vilaseca's last point, which is that I want to show how Rainy Taxi represents a conflict between Dalí's attitudes, his personality, and his work, at the same time as it offers us something specific about the political debate around the Civil War in Spain, which ran from 1936 to 1939, and perhaps Dalí's surrealist engagement with it. Here I should say that there are no recorded mentions of the Civil War in Vilaseca's index, only a handful for surrealism, and one mention of Rainy Taxi, which is located in the first chapter in relation to George Orwell, and I'll return to this shortly. At the same time, I'm mindful of Vilaseca's later observation that for the majority of Dalí's critics and biographers, the act of reading and making sense of the contradictions and heterogeneities reveals itself to be an act of reducing and eliminating them drastically in favour of a single all too clear explanation. My reading is, of course, not the only reading of Rainy Taxi. Along with some of Dalí's other installations, Rainy Taxi has been read archivally and in detail by Lewis Capture, as an example of the worlding of surrealism by Effie Renson, and most often elsewhere as a publicity stunt or a headline grabber. If it is mentioned in other critical texts, it's often done so without any detailed analysis, and stands in for a longer commentary about Dalí and or his work. Rainy Taxi is read as if the joke is on us, the audience. Is this really modern art? Or that it's Dalí by extension who is the joke? As Vilaseca concludes, hovering between the most contradictory opinions regarding the artistic value of his work, between consumerism and high culture, between nostalgic notions of mastery and genius, and that which poses a constant challenge to traditional I'll start that again. Hovering between the most contradictory opinions regarding the artistic value of his work, between consumerism and high culture, between nostalgic notions of mastery and genius, and that which poses a constant challenge to traditional definitions of subjective unity and property, Dalí is still very much an open question in contemporary Western culture. He is an apocryphal subject who looked at himself in the mirror and laughed at what he saw. The joke was indeed on us and the worry ours. In my talk tonight, I'll try to locate the worry that lurks for me in the Rainy Taxi. Let's start with what Dalí says about the Civil War and the Second World War in his autobiographical writings. I'm going to refer to two texts, also referenced by Vilaseca, and these are The Secret Life of Salvador Dalí, written during the Second World War and published in 1942, and The Unspeakable Confessions of Salvador Dalí, translated into English from the French Comment on devient Dalí, and published in 1976. Both texts had translators, Économé Chevalier for The Secret Life, and then Harold J. Salamson for André Parinot's Unspeakable Confessions. As Vilaseca stated, and as we'll see with the explanatory note for Rainy Taxi, Dalí's reported speech and writing move across language borders. and the autobiographical texts move across disciplinary boundaries. This unsteady language, perhaps, shows evidence of Dalí's chosen and forced displacements throughout his life, and the fractures of his incorporation and rejection within the Parisian surrealist group, as well as his playful engagement with expressions of his own identity and artistry. The first part of The Secret Life looks at Dalí's childhood, but parts 2 and 3 begin and then end with the European War, World War I, and the New European War, World War II. The Spanish Civil War also appears in this final part, and Dalí retrospectively sets the tone of the war through the voices of builders working on his house in Portuguese in 1934. And this is a long quote, so please bear with me. We were thus preparing to leave for Barcelona, and before leaving Portuguese, we went to take a glass of wine with the masons who were working on the new story to our house to say goodbye to them. They were in the midst of discussing politics. The finest thing in the world, one of them said, I mean finest, and I don't care what anybody says, is anarchy, what you might call libertarian communism. And when I say fine, I mean it's a very fine idea, but you can't put it into practice. So I'm satisfied with a good liberal socialism, with a few variations that I've thought up myself. The only thing that appeals to me about all that, said another, is integral free love. Everything bad comes from people not having their fill of love. Another said, I'm for syndicalism, clean and stripped and no politics mixed up in it. And for this idea, I wouldn't stop at anything. I'd even overturn all the streetcars that were necessary. Another said, neither syndicalism nor socialism. Communism is the only thing. Communism as Stalin understands it. It's the only realistic way out. Communism, sure, said another, but you've got to know what kind you mean, because there are 5 different kinds, not counting my own, which is the right kind. It's been proved and demonstrated that the Stalinists are murderers of free men, just as criminal as the fascists. The problem of Trotskyism was an acute one at that time. But the important thing for all of them was to bring about the revolution. After that, one would see. The Master Mason listened with consternation to all this debate over various isms. Then, nodding his head, he said to them, do you want me to tell you how all this is going to end? It's going to end with a military dictatorship that will make all of us shrivel up and won't allow any of us to breathe. Dalí's Greek chorus of builders paint a vivid picture of the factions on the left and their internal fighting, setting the scene for the conflict which would follow and its ultimate conclusion. A couple of pages later in The Secret Life, Dalí states, Dalí states, I was definitely not a historic man. On the contrary, I felt myself essentially anti-historic and apolitical. And yet this script of the 6 communisms and the 6 Masons seems to me to tell a story about Dalí's understanding of the war, just as much as it might tell us about its historical conditions. George Orwell dedicates a chapter in the appendix to his 1938 Homage to Catalonia, to a discussion of these different left-wing factions engaged under the anti-fascist banner in the Civil War. Early on in Homage to Catalonia, Orwell makes an observation which sounds like a wartime Dalí and brings to mind some of Dalí's repeating images. We were near the front line now, near enough to smell the characteristic smell of war, in my experience, a smell of excrement and decaying food. Along with Dalí's beams, Orwell shares Dalí's concern with animal life broadly understood, matching Dalí's donkeys, worms and ants with mules, lice and rodents to similar effect. Vilaseca also brings in Orwell in his discussion of Dalí's apolitical position in the Civil War, citing Orwell's criticism of Dalí in his 1944 essay, Benefit of Clergy, Some Notes on Salvador Dalí, in which Orwell reviews Dalí's Secret Life. Vilaseca argues against Orwell's moral judgment of Dalí's character and art. Orwell singles out Rainy Taxi, or at least a photograph of it in The Secret Life. Entitled Mannequin Rotting in a Taxicab, Orwell describes it as diseased and disgusting. In part, it seems to me through a misreading of it, describing it as apparently some kind of faked photograph. Over the already somewhat bloated face and breast of the apparently dead girl, huge snails are crawling. In the caption below the picture, Dalí notes that these are burgundy snails, that is, the edible kind. For me, Orwell's criticism is reminiscent of commentary on Buñuel's ethical choice to film a young girl purportedly dying from inflamed gums in his documentary Tierra sin Pan filmed in 1933, who's discovered decades later by Catalan scholar Mercè Bats to have survived. To paraphrase Vilaseca here, it seems both Dalí and Buñuel are laughing in the mirror. A few pages later in The Secret Life, Dalí states clearly, "The Spanish Civil War changed none of my ideas. I did not want to be called anything but Dalí, but already the hyena of public opinion was slinking around me, demanding of me with the drawling menace of its expectant teeth that I make up my mind at last, that I become Stalinist or Hitlerite. No, 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 and 1,000 times no." In line with his claims to genius, Dalí sees himself as sui generis, and yet his description of the hyena of public opinion is reminiscent of Leonora Carrington's short story, The Debutante, written around 1937 to 1938, in which a young woman who doesn't want to come out to society sends her friend the hyena to the ball instead, but only after the hyena and the young socialite conspire to kill the family maid and use her face as the hyena's disguise. The repeated negative which ends this section makes reference to a song from the US in 1934, which became the title of a Betty Boop short film in 1935, in which a villainous balloonist tries to steal Betty away from her beloved. Given Dalí's interest in language, and especially the literal, as seen in the cocktail shaker door handle in her Chant de Loup, and in the sculptures like the 1936 Venus de Milo with a chest of drawers, I'm sure this linguistic mixing of high and low culture is deliberate and works both to undermine Dalí's statement of individuality and support it. I think this language also points at the schism between Dalí and surrealism, most importantly that he didn't want to pick a side, but I think his art is partial. To return to Orwell's criticism of The Secret Life, I think there's an acknowledgement of the type of critical commentary Vilaseca is looking for. I'll quote Orwell again. "It's a book that stinks. If it were possible for a book to give a physical stink off its pages, this one would. A thought that might please Dalí, who, before wooing his future wife for the first time, rubbed himself all over with an ointment made of goat's dung, oiled up in fish glue. But against this has to be set the fact that Dalí is a draftsman of very exceptional gifts. He is also, to judge by the minuteness and the sureness of his drawings, a very hard worker. He is an exhibitionist and a careerist, but he is not a fraud. He has 50 times more talent than most of the people who would denounce his morals and jeer at his paintings. And these two sets of facts, taken together, raise a question which, for lack of any basis of agreement, seldom gets a real discussion." I think Orwell's question here is the same or a similar question to the one Vilaseca is answering in this book, and it's one I'm interested in answering here this evening. There's much critical commentary on Dalí's alleged opinions and surrealist shock tactics and actions during the war. But in the same way as Orwell believes Dalí's Edwardian upbringing to have left a visible influence on Dalí's artistic interests, so I am arguing that just because Dalí claims to be apolitical in The Secret Life, this doesn't mean that his artistic work is apolitical. As Orwell concludes, but neither ought one to pretend in the name of detachment that such pictures, as mannequin rotting in a taxicab are morally neutral. Diseased and disgusting is as good a description of Orwell on the Aragonese front as it is of brainy taxi, and Dalí is making us look at ourselves again in the mirror. Dalí returns to Figueres, Cadaqués and Portuguese in June 1940, following the first bombardment of Bordeaux, near to where he and his wife Gala fled at the start of the Second World War. His return appears in both The Secret Life and The Unspeakable Confessions, but there's a change between the two. Sorry about this. Between the two, which reflects their respective publication dates. Excuse me. I'm just going to take a cough sleep. Firstly, in the 1942 Secret Life, Dalí proclaims, "Nothing had changed in 11 years, and everything had remained the same in spite of the 3 years of civil war and revolution." Dalí is marking an important difference here between the Civil War and the revolutionary 6 months at the start of the war, when factions on the left hoped for lasting equality amongst classes and genders. As Orwell states, they'd attempted to produce within the militias a sort of temporary working model of the classless society. Of course, there was not perfect equality, but there was a nearer approach to it than I had ever seen, or than I would ever have thought conceivable in time of war. Now, in the later unspeakable confessions, we get a judgment on the both unchanged and wasted post-war domestic landscape of the house of his father, also named Salvador Dalí, and a Catalan nationalist. Excuse me. All the things around me, as real and indestructible as my soul, were in their places. All the executions have been for nothing, tortures for nothing. My sister had almost lost her mind, but she too had come back to sanity. There's a clear sense of dismissal here. However, if we return to the war text of The Secret Life, we can see the same list in a more exhaustive form. It's true that my sister had been tortured by the sim and driven to insanity, but she was already completely cured. It's true that a bomb had ripped a balcony from our house, but no one had ever looked precisely at that balcony before. It's true that the floor tiling in our dining room was all blackened by the fire that the anarchists had made when they would cook their meals right in the middle of the room. But this was just the spot where the large dining table stood, and to see this damage it was necessary to move the table, which, though it vanished for 2 months, was found again 20 kilometres from Figueras at a dentist's. Like the film of a destructive catastrophe run in reverse, after the revolutionary explosion, everything, as by enchantment, returned to its original and traditional place. This more complete text betrays a closeness to the event, which the later version does not. Dalí's reading of the destruction and devastation is a compromised fairy tale where there's a resolution but no happy ending. I would argue both autobiographical texts betray Dalí's disillusionment with the end results of his young engagement with anarchism, to which I'll return, and of his later professional collaboration with surrealist artists on the left. This sentiment presages remarks made by Buñuel, published in French earlier in the 70s and given here in translation. The fact is that with the war in Spain, everything we thought about, at least everything I'd thought about, became reality. The burning of convents, war, killings, and I was scared stiff. And not only that, I was against it. I'm a revolutionary, but revolution horrifies me. I'm an anarchist, but I'm totally against the anarchists. The Unspeakable Confessions reveals the safety of historical distance through its summation of events unavailable to The Secret Life. It had all been for nothing. The Unspeakable Confessions was published in French 2 years before the end of the dictatorship, and its title reflects both the censorship of this period as well as Dalí's own censorship. The English translation came out the year after Franco's death, and also after the Pacto del Olvido, or Pact of Forgetting, agreed by Spain's opposing political parties in order to move on from the civil war and subsequent dictatorship and into a democratic future, which, like other democracies in the West, is again struggling. And it's the grandchildren of Dalí's generation who are now seeking to uncover this intentionally forgotten past. For a more recent meditation on this, I'll refer you to Pedro Almodóvar's COVID period film, Madres Paralelas, Mothers. To return to Vilaseca's work, there's an interesting link here to Dalí's own subjectivity, which appears in both autobiographical texts. An epigraph at the start of Vilaseca's first chapter reads, "De Dalís hay cuatro, y el mejor es el quinto." This is taken from Manuel del Arco's 1952, Dalí al Desnudo, whose book is again representative of the type of scholarship Vilaseca critiques. It also appears in Paul Julian Smith's caring obituary for David. Vilaseca writes, "A great deal of the existing studies of the artist seem to be based upon a clear-cut distinction between an internal and an external Dalí. One is the real Dalí, and the other is merely apparent." The key to understanding Dalí for Vilaseca is that there is no one key to understanding him. In opposition to Arco and other essentializing critics, Vilaseca doesn't want to subordinate alterity, Dalí's eccentricity and difference, to an economy of unity and sameness. Dalí es así y no de otra manera. Dalí is like this and not another. Hence the multiple Dalís in the title of tonight's lecture. When read through the lens of the Civil War, the fifth Dalí becomes more provocative. We've already seen the use of the number 5 to describe the different types of communism in the exchange between the Masons. This phrasing also seems to make use of a military strategy reported in the Republican press and well known during this period, which Ernest Hemingway used in part as the title for his 1938 play, The Fifth Column. Here's an explanatory quote from the preface to the play. The title refers to the Spanish rebel statement in the fall of 1936 that they had 4 columns advancing on Madrid and a 5th column of sympathisers inside the city to attack the defenders of the city from the rear. It seems likely to me then that Dalí, in Arco's quotation above, is using this formulation of a split militaristic strategy with a hidden internal force to describe his own multiple personality fronts, with the fifth Dalí perhaps the inner genius which is outed by the end of his autobiography. He's also perhaps displaying his knowledge of the original reporting on the event in the Republican press, as discussed in detail by Julius Ruth in his 2014 book, The Red Terror and the Spanish Civil War. So when we look at Dalí's autobiographical writings, we can see a clear discussion of the Civil War and its impact on him and his family. This is also the period during which he paints this war in oil onto his canvases, which explicitly engage the Civil War, as you can see here on this slide, in the 1936 paintings, Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of Civil War, and Autumnal Cannibalism. It seems unlikely to me, therefore, that Rainy Taxi, also constructed during this period, should have no link to the war itself. Elena Filipovich makes the case for the 1938 International Surrealist Exhibition to be read as an exhibition at war, as per the title of her essay, the 2003 Surrealism, Politics and Culture monograph. But following Vilaseca's argument and Dalí's own paranoid critical method, it also seems likely that the references are multiple, contradictory, both apparent and latent. And in this next section, I'd like to look at the individual elements of the installation, starting with the taxi. Donna Des, one of the preeminent Dalí art historians, describes Rainy Taxi following Dalí as a monument, and in comparison with other avant-garde objects made by, for example, Marcel Duchamp or Man Ray, Rainy Taxi has had several incarnations, the fourth and final of which is cited in the entrance hall to Dalí's Theatre Museum in Figueres. There are important differences between this edition and the first one in 1938. Firstly, Rainy Taxi plays with the frivolity with which it's viewed. On entering the courtyard to the gallery where the exhibition was held, visitors might have expected to see a fountain, only to be greeted instead with a taxi raining on the inside. Excuse me. Of course, Duchamp's 1917 fountain changed the course of modern art, and it could well be that Dalí's taxi is in conversation with that piece. The Rainy Taxi's fountain reading plays out in the Dalí Museum. Here, the taxi, now Dalí's Cadillac, is once again located in the courtyard entrance to the museum, and its seats have been scattered not with snails, which are plasticised on the inside, but with coins tossed in to make a wish, as if it were a fountain. A second important change concerns the occupants of the taxi. Whereas in Figueres there are 2 dummy passengers, a man and a woman, in Paris there's only 1 passenger. Both feature a driver, however. In the 38 version, the mannequin has a shark's head over the driver's head. Shortly, I'll discuss how the driver acts out Dalí's vision of a monster. But here, when I'm arguing that Rainy Taxi lends its support to the political left, I think this disguise conceals the taxi driver's revolutionary status. In 1934, Dalí escapes Barcelona for France with paintings for a future exhibition in New York. He was fleeing the October insurrection and the Madrid government's subsequent reprisals. Robin Adele Greeley writes persuasively about Dalí's ambiguous political allegiances during the 30s. In The Secret Life, Dalí describes his escape and the actions of his chauffeur. Both Adez and Greeley state he was driven by an anarchist taxi driver who, citing Dalí, carried the flags of Spain and Catalonia so that he was protected either way. Taxis also feature in homage to Catalonia, and Orwell observes that machine gun nests that the fascists had placed at strategic spots were smashed by rushing taxis at them at 60 miles an hour. With thanks to my colleague Mechtilde Albert, taxis were also used to transport fascist prisoners to the walls of execution, and their sound spread terror across combatants on the right. I don't think Dalí's use of the taxi is neutral in 1938, though it may be obfuscated, and its dislocation from Spain is both a provocation and a disguise. In an exhibition run of only 6 weeks, its lasting impact in terms of later censorship for both Dalí and his work is also limited, and this is compounded by the later revisions. I think I want to argue then that Rainy Taxi has been lost as a political monument on the left, and that we can make that argument through the historical evidence and texts I've discussed this evening. I've already cited Orwell's canonical work on the Civil War. For me, there's another text also written in English, which precedes Orwell's account, and which Orwell reviews favourably, and which really brings to life the revolutionary period of the Civil War. This text was written by 2 authors also associated with the Parisian surrealist group, Mary Lowe and Juan Brea. Crucially for my argument, it also makes the case for the revolutionary status of the taxi. Red Spanish Notebook, the first 6 months of the Revolution and the Civil War, is known to readers on the political left and far left and hosted on a Marxist website, but is perhaps less well known outside these circles. It was published in 1937 by London press Sackville and Warburg, also publishers for George Orwell, and Trinidadian philosopher C.L.R. James, author of World Revolution and the Black Jacobins on the Haitian Revolution, and a fellow Marxist like Lowe and Brea. And it's C.L.R. James who writes the introduction for Red Spanish Notebook, where he observes, Catalonia leads Spain, and for some few months at least, the workers and peasants of Catalonia, politically inexperienced, thought that the new world had come. There's no room for the democratic republic in Spain today. Either Spain must go back to a nightmare of reaction, infinitely worse than the old feudalism, or on to the social revolution. In his youth, Dalí, like many other young Catalans of the period, engaged with communism and anarchism. Robin Adele Greeley dates this back to 1919, when Dalí would have been a teenager. Dawn Ades notes an incident in 1923 when Dalí was back home in Catalonia, having been suspended from art school in Madrid for subversive behaviour. Now about 19, Ades states Dalí was arrested and imprisoned for a month, first in Figueres and then in Girona, having been implicated in the burning of the Spanish flag after rioting at the art school in Figueres during a popular uprising against the extra-legal dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, who'd seized power in 1923. One of Dalí's friends through this period and into the 1930s was fellow Catalan Jaume Miravitlles. An international surrealist audience might know him first and best as the second priest alongside Dalí, who gets dragged along behind the piano in Un Chant de Loup, perhaps surrealism's most famous film and Dalí's first with Monroe. Miravitlles was politically engaged on the left and went on to have an important role during the Civil War as head of the Propaganda Commission of the Generalitat Catalan government. Earlier in the 1930s, Miravitlles described Dalí as a fellow traveller of the non-Stalinist, communist Bloc Obreri Camperol, or Workers and Peasants Far Left Bloc, though Dalí was never a formal member. For our purposes today, it's interesting to note that the Bloc would later become part of the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, or the Workers' Party for Marxist Unification, and it's the POUM for whom Mary Lowe and Juan Brea report during the first 6 months of the Civil War. In Red Spanish Notebook, taxis work as a metaphor for the initial revolution of the Civil War and then its loss as the revolutionary impulse gives way to all-out war. At the start of Red Spanish Notebook, when Lowe and Brea arrive in Spain in July 36, they find it changed, as Mary Lowe reports in the first chapter. We knew Barcelona because we'd been there before in bourgeois days. Now we stood at the entrance to the station with our knapsacks on our backs and thought how overgrown with dust everything seemed to have become since then. A line of horses stood drooping their long thin necks in front of some cabs. There were no taxis because these had been abolished. Still, people with luggage must be brought somehow from the station. In chapter 11, Juan Brea reports a similar ban on taxis in Madrid. But by chapter 16, the taxis are back, as Mary Lowe describes in The Changing Aspect. The first taxi had already crept back weeks ago. The Federación Anarquista Ibérica, or the Iberian Anarchist Federation, seemed altogether to have forgotten the childish ferocity with which they'd abolished the taxis in the first place. Now they were just as childishly proud of their new creation. Advertisements appeared on all the walls, showing the new cars, painted in the trades union colours, sitting on a giant hand over the legend, Our Work. The colours are supposed to make everything all right. Mary Lowe in particular is disappointed by the loss of comradeship and horizontal governing structures, in favour of the former and more traditional hierarchies, symbolised linguistically by the return of the formal pronoun usted. Chapter 17 is the penultimate chapter in the book and sees Lo and Brea return, disillusioned to Paris. Lo and Brea narrate a social history that was also Dalí's domestic reality. In Armed with Madness, a 2023 graphic novel about the life of surrealist artist Leonora Carrington, written by Mary M. Talbot and illustrated by her husband, the graphic artist Brian Talbot, there's a page dedicated to the International Surrealist Exhibition, which shows Dalí's rain taxi in the courtyard of the Galerie Beaux-Arts, with pools of water underneath it from the internal water feature, which wet the feet of the bourgeois visitors on arrival at the gallery. It seems plausible that with the water would have come the snails, escaping from the installation and likely crushed under the feet of the visitors as they walked past the taxi. Through an environmental humanities lens, this now appears as a thoughtless artistic gesture. As a metaphor for destruction, the sound and sensations of the crushed snails are unparalleled and yet reminiscent of similar acts of human and animal cruelty, real and imagined, in the work of both Dalí and Buñuel, including in Buñuel's documentary Tierra sin Pan that I've already mentioned, that was released as Republican propaganda during the Civil War. If Dalí's historical circumstances, domestic reality, and youthful political allegiances conspire to give a reading of Rainy Taxi as a now lost political monument to the left, what's the significance of the female mannequin in the rear of the taxi? In The Secret Life, Dalí discusses his window displays at New York department store Bonwit Teller, the first of which were in 1936 after the start of the Civil War. In the following excerpt, Dalí is discussing his designs from 1939, which were the cause of his increasing notoriety in the US, after he pushed the bathtub in the display through the window in an angry but unintended protest about changes to his designs. Talking about mannequins he used in the window, he writes, "I detested modern mannequins, those horrible creatures so hard, so inedible, with their idiotically turned up noses. This time I wanted flesh, artificial flesh, as anachronistic as possible. We went and unearthed in the attic of an old shop some frightful wax mannequins of the 1900 period, with long, natural dead women's hair. These mannequins were marvellously covered with several years' dust and cobwebs. I said to Lee, 'Be sure not to let anyone touch that dust, it's their chief beauty.' In the day display, one of these mannequins was stepping into a hairy bathtub lined with astrakhan." Dalí had already used wax mannequins in Rainy Taxi and was delighted to witness their decomposition in the water over the course of the exhibition run. There's a similar emphasis on decay in these dusty Bonwit Teller mannequins. There's also an implied critique here in Dalí's retrospectively written words of the women shoppers whose protests against Dalí's displays had caused the changes to his designs and prompted Dalí's subsequent outrage. The hairy bathtub stands in relation with Merritt Oppenheim's object, or fur-lined teacup, exhibited 3 years previously in Paris in the Exposition Surrealiste d'Objets at the Charles Raton Gallery, in which Dalí also had his own tray of objects. Oppenheim's object and Dalí's Rainy Taxi are brought together under artistic license in the exhibition illustration in Armed with Madness that you can see, along with imagined discussions around the role of women artists in surrealism. More recently, Luxembourgish filmmaker Badi Mink adapted Oppenheim's fur teacup into a furry tongue in her 2009 short La Belle et la Bête, The Beauty is the Beast, as seen in Patricia Almer's exhibition The Traumatic Surreal, which ran at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds from November last year to March this year. The pun in Mink's title underlines the link between the fairy tale and the furry fabric, and Dalí's Astrakhan is selling a similar fairy tale vision. Alongside Oppenheim and Carrington, Dalí also appears to reference work by Galician artist Maruja Mayo, currently the subject of a retrospective at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Mayo and Dalí were non-conforming students and friends in Madrid, and during the early 40s, Mayo made a series of paintings featuring shells, flowers, and plant life, entitled Naturaleza Viva, a play on the Spanish description of still life, or Naturaleza Muerta. In Unspeakable Confessions, Dalí describes his own still life from 1956 as nature morte vivante, using the same wordplay in French. while the English translation, fast-moving still life, maintains an avant-garde link to futurism through the use of speed. Dalí speaks of the picture becoming the privileged locus of a geometry that translates not only the loftiest scientific and philosophical speculations, but allows me, Dalí, essentially to know the truth of time and space, revealing his Renaissance man interest in the arts and sciences. For Dalí, each picture is a paranoia critical consciousness, and perhaps this sisterhood of women surrealist artists is part of Dalí's paranoia critical consciousness. I don't think this sisterhood is represented by the female passenger mannequin, however. Rather, she's a figure to be exploited, not unlike the exhibition's other mannequins featured in its reimagined streets of Paris, and to which Dalí also contributed an example. Dalí makes little reference to the 1938 exhibition in The Secret Life, mentioning only a surrealist exhibition in which the entries were arranged according to the perfectly collectivist criterion of the order of the alphabet, which is a reference to the Dictionnaire abrégé du surréalisme, edited by Breton and Paul Éluard, and released to accompany the exhibition, and in which an image of Oppenheim's object, renamed by Breton, is also included. Dalí goes on to say that the order of the alphabet is not my speciality, and I've had the gift of always being outside it. A comment which, as Enrique Bou and others have argued, suggests Dalí may have experienced dyslexia, which might account for the difficulties in writing evident in the Rainy Taxi note, and commented on by so many of his critics, and corrected at length by those editing his work, including Breton and Catalan art historian Félix Furness. In The Unspeakable Confessions, however, in the 13th chapter entitled How to Dominate Men, Subjugate Women, and Stupefy Children, Dalí is asked specifically how he considers the surrealist exhibition of 1938. Dalí, along with Max Ernst, were listed as special advisors to the exhibition. After giving a description of the exhibition's interior, Dalí describes Rainy Taxi in the following way. I asked that there be erected a monument made up of a taxi with a roof full of holes that would let a continual rain seep through on a Venus lying amongst the lichens and driven by a monster. The discussion of this request in The Unspeakable Confessions reveals that Dalí perceived Rainy Taxi as striking a big blow to Breton, who he thought was going to explode with rage. Rainy Taxi then becomes Dalí's explosive thrown from outside the exhibition. To further taunt Breton, he'd wanted to create a general commissariat of public imagination. Again, the militaristic references specifically to the Civil War are clear here. It's worth noting that the sections on the exhibition and the opening night in The Unspeakable Confessions are followed immediately by a section on how Dalí reacted to war, in which the implied war is the Second World War, and a verse from Lorca's Baladilla de los Tres Ríos, or the Little Ballad of the Three Rivers, the only reference to the Civil War. Dalí's description of Rainy Taxi in The Unspeakable Confessions is an abbreviated version of the exhibition text, which was pinned to the installation and is reproduced in full with a translation by Effie Rensu in her book on the wording of surrealism, and you have it here in the middle of the slide. Rensu reads the misspelled language of Dalí's note as graphic rather than, or better, as well as phonetic, so just as concerned with the presentation of the characters as well as their faithful transcription. Rensu states, Dalí indeed is performing paranoid criticism through the misspelling of his adoptive language. He writes in French, but a French that is simulated, a French that sounds like French when read aloud, but which looks like a foreign language, rich with hidden layers of meaning when written. Rensu reads the note from a French national and museological perspective, and I recommend its reading to you. Rensu's translation of the note brings out its fairy tale qualities. The 12 Lilliputian frogs, each of them wearing a very delicate golden crown hanging from their head. And this underscores the fairy tale aspect of Rainy Taxi, as also does Lewis Catcher in his book on the exhibition, with the female passenger as the princess and Dalí as the frog prince, albeit in tiny fictional multiplied form. This reading sits uncomfortably alongside the taxi's compromised wartime status. Of course, the term compromiso in Spanish contains its own oppositions, meaning both political commitment and compromise. Vilaseca also makes this fairy tale connection to Dalí and his claims to genius in his final chapter, in which he looks at Dalí through the looking glass. Vilaseca writes, In the memoirs, by giving himself to himself as his own model, Dalí finally gives birth to himself as his own illusion of subjective exceptionality and uniqueness. Following both Dalí and Vilaseca, it would seem possible to me that Dalí identifies with both the anarchist taxi driver we created and the missing fairy tale frogless princess, and also the princess passenger. Rainy Taxi's mannequin is Venus lying among the lichens. She's not Botticelli's birth of Venus, but her decomposing sister. In many readings of Rainy Taxi, the mannequin is a representation of a socialite or a woman of high status. The compromised courtyard scene which greeted visitors to the Surrealism exhibition worked as an unflattering mirror to the audience, portraying the well-to-do patrons of the gallery as decadent. This is picked up on by American Vogue editor Bettina Wilson, who reviewed the international exhibition for the March 1st edition in 1938, and noted that the taxi rain dripped onto the pavement and soaked the guests' evening slippers. Wilson finished her article with mention of a luncheon the following day, at which diners claimed the exhibition to be boring, unhealthy art, and concludes that Parisians had eaten their favourite shishi dish and found that it gave them indigestion. Decadence works at a literal and a metaphorical level. Over the course of the exhibition, Venus decayed in the water. At a metaphorical level, Rainy Taxi reflected the decadence, or perhaps luxury and privilege, of a wealthy international art audience, at one remove from pressing contemporary social and political concerns, like the Spanish Civil War. This glace sans teint, or silverless mirror, reveals the surrealism in the installation. The target of Rainy Taxi's humour is the invited bourgeois audience, and it's a female mannequin which stands in misogynistically for this audience. The double vision of Dalí's monument Rainy Taxi is also proof that Dalí's paranoid critical method, which he'd been working on since 1929, could be monumentalised, and indeed later would be in his theatre museum. In the installation note, Le Taxi plus vieux pour dame snob et surréaliste, Dalí draws on the figure of the snob, to which he extends a chapter in the Unspeakable Confessions. In keeping with the grandiosity of his genius project, the snob is now a super snob, in line with the superrealism of his work, and the super snob is female and wealthy and multiple. In this chapter, Dalí discusses his friendships with beauty magnate Helena Rubinstein, arts patron Missy Assert, and fashion designer Gabrielle Coco Chanel, whom he describes as his best friend in The Secret Life. Dalí and Gala spend part of the Civil War in Italy and France with Coco Chanel, and it's at Chanel's villa on the French Riviera in 1938 that Dalí paints Apparition of Face and Fruit Dish on a Beach, the image from tonight's poster and on this slide, and part of the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art collection in Hartford, Connecticut in the US. According to the museum's curatorial narrative, Dalí created this dazzling and disorienting image in memory of his friend, the poet Federico García Lorca, who was killed by fascists in the early days of the Spanish Civil War. He conjures Lorca not through likeness, but through metamorphosis. A barren beach becomes a fruit dish, which becomes a dog, and somehow also Lorca's face. The outline of the face, with its paranoid critical reconstruction in the viewer's gaze, shares similarities with other paintings of Lorca's outline, which in the early years of their friendship were often combined by Dalí with his own outline. As well as speaking of the importance of wealthy patrons for the arts, Apparition also speaks to an implied equivalence between Dalí and the super snob, in this case Chanel, as Dalí suggests in the Unspeakable Confessions. I was genius, as Diaghilev was dance, and Coco was fashion. The female passenger is the stand-in socialite targeted by the surrealists. She is also the super snob at which Dalí aims. The book cover of Vilaseca's apocryphal subject features a photograph of Dalí dressed as Egyptian Queen Nefertiti, taken around 1923 in Figueras, during the period of his life when he was attending Madrid's San Fernando Institute of Painting, Sculpture and Drawing. The description of the photograph opens Vilaseca's fourth chapter on projection, parody and transdressing, which he describes as a neologism he uses to extend the sense of transvestism to include Dalí's adoption of multiple forms of dress and disguise, which do not necessarily straddle the gender divide. In the first epigraph to this chapter, Vilaseca quotes Dalí from The Secret Life. I've desired ever since to be like a beautiful woman. Dalí is referring to a period in his childhood when he tried to look like a little girl while naked, and also to a later, more recent experience at art school when he was painting a little girl life model wrapped in white satin, whose folds were the subject of the drapery class he was taking. Dalí felt his painting was poorly executed, as the little girl kept wriggling and was allowed to take breaks from the sitting. In the second part of chapter 4, Vilaseca makes a psychoanalytic reading of transvestism, writing that the transvestite not only believes, at least in his imagination, in the existence of the phallic woman, he actually becomes her, identifies with her. Vilaseca argues that passages in Dalí's memoirs prove the subsequent point. The dread of the real female genitalia remains the stigma of the primary repression of the feminine, upon which transvestism paradoxically rests. The Venus of Rainy Taxi is in this reading a projection of Dalí dressed like a beautiful woman. It was, of course, Dalí who was seated in the rear of the taxi during his escape from Catalonia. And once the wax Venus, together with her chauffeur, had melted in the exhibition Internal Rain, only Dalí will remain. The vagina dentata of the formerly phallic mother has been displaced to the shark's teeth hat of the taxi driver as monster, and as a former anarchist, Dalí is implicated politically in both figures. While Dalí writes little of the 1938 exhibition in The Secret Life, the uncredited image of the mannequin, cropped from a wide-shot still photograph by, I think, Denise Bellon, is included in the third and final part of The Secret Life, as we've heard in the discussion of Orwell's review of the book. You can see on screen here. In the cropped, now medium shot of the mannequin against the inside of the taxi, we see her wet hair and dishevelled appearance, her neck covered in snails, her chest exposed by the pattern stole slipping down and over her shoulder, ivy and other plant life trailing across the seat behind her. The hand is held up across her chest in a defensive gesture, requesting the viewer look away, the hand raised in protest against the camera. She is the beautiful woman of the era, the film starlet caught unawares by the press photographers. It's clear from the references to the super snob in the autobiographical writings that Dalí envisages himself in a similar role. In this image, the mannequin does not appear wearing a sordid cretonne printed with Mies Angelus and the Gleaners, as per Dalí's note, though the Gleaners print can be seen in photographs of Rainy Taxi by Raoul Roubaix, where we see more of the mannequin's dress and the print across the torso. The sordid refers to the tough French cotton cretonne that would be used in domestic interiors and soft furnishings. It's left to Dalí himself, in the image next to the mannequin in The Secret Life, which you can see there. In a photograph taken by Georges Elie from 1934, Dalí balances on a writing table, wearing what look like long johns and socks with a tweed jacket, over which he wears a cushion cover reproduction of Mies Angelus, which close-up looks like a tapestry design, and in outline brings to mind the cubist shapes of his earlier paintings. Again, this photograph appears to have been cropped, and in the full version, which illustrates Dalí's essay on the Angelus, and appears in the Dictionnaire abrégé in an entry entitled Être Objet, a human version of Oppenheim's furry cup, we can see Dalí's head hidden under a second Millet cushion cover reproduction, this time featuring Des Glaneuses. In the second version, as we'll see shortly, rather than hanging by his side in the headless image, his left hand is cupped and his right holds forth the fish. Vilaseca concludes the apocryphal subject with commentary on recent uses and misuses of Dalí's artwork. This chimes with Dalí's own comments cited by Vilaseca earlier in the book. J'encourage toujours les gens à reproduire mes tableaux, car je trouve les reproductions plus belles que les originaux. In this photograph of Dalí as cushion cover, which accompanies the Rainy Taxi in The Secret Life, he becomes a reproduction of his touchstone image in a way in which the accompanying photographed Rainy Taxi mannequin does not. Dalí's essay on the tragic myth of Mies Angelus was not published until 1963, but it was written around 1933. In 1935, Dalí published an essay in luxury surrealist magazine Minotaur, entitled in translation, Aerodynamic Apparitions of Object Beings, in which he associates the lyricism of the extraction of blackheads from nasal pores to the lyricism of a new conception of space. As Astrid Ruffer further explains in her article, this association is very bizarre, since it places the trivial, everyday world and the scientific world in parallel. In any case, the association enables Dalí to trace the evolution of the idea of space. From the unsubstantial space of Euclid, one reaches the space-time of Einstein. Ruth reveals Dalí as scientist. Dalí set out 5 stages in this process. 1. The ideal and non-physical space of Euclid, which is compared to a broth. 2. The 3-dimensional space of René Descartes, which is compared to slightly denser juice. 3. The space of Newton, in which forces are acting and which acquires the gravity of the apple. 4. The space of James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, which is characterized by physical states, and which appropriates objects by saying, the apple is mine. 5. The 4-dimensional space of Einstein, which is compared to a voracious beet which squeezes strange bodies. Dalí's cross-disciplinary journalism presents a fascinating look at the role of blackheads in the space-time continuum, and makes a larger point about the impact of space on bodies, especially curved figures like those of the Millet paintings. In this scientific essay, we find the 2 images of Dalí and Millet are actually part of a trio, in which the 3rd image is of Dalí in the same clothes, but now minus the cushion covers, lying curved under the writing table on his left side, with his capped head propped up on his left arm. The top of his head faces the camera and is decorated with a fish, with the 2nd fish propped up on his left leg. In these images, it's Dalí who's the mannequin, and represents the uncanny double, which is not a double, and whose figure lies at the heart of subjectivity. As Vilaseca concludes in his 4th chapter, Dressed to Kill, in his transdressing acts, Dalí mixes signs, styles, and codes. Like Derrida's bricoleur, he constructs from what is already there, using garments and jewellery he finds around him, clothes and codes which he playfully mixes and redefines, upsets and supplements. In so doing, Dalí is constructing his own identity from those remains, from the remains of all the identities which go hand in hand with each piece involved in the collage. And this is not all, for he is implicitly stating the inevitable parodic, mimetic and bricoleur-like character of all gender and identity categories. This reads like a description of Dalí's construction of Rainy Taxi, and Vilaseca's discussion links to key surrealist practices like collage. Vilaseca makes this observation into a wider commentary on gender and identity. So to conclude my talk this evening on the composite structure I've argued Dalí's Rainy Taxi is, I'd like to look finally at one of these supplementary elements. I'd like to return to the dust which so attracted Dalí to the Bonwit telemannequins. This chimes with work I've done elsewhere with textile artist Dr. Angela Maddock, Jean-Jacques Lacan, and the quilting point, or point de capital. Lacan describes the schema for the quilting point as essential in human experience. For Lacan, the quilting point is the point at which the signified and the signifier are knotted together, between the still floating mass of meanings that are actually circulating. This phrasing relates for me to Vilaseca's collage argument, in that there's a moment at which meaning is made, which might be transitory and composed of some elements among other choices, but just for a moment this meaning coheres, is fixed, or is stitched in. Tonight what interests me is Lacan's description of the upholstery button as this point. To quote Lacan in Russell Griggs' translation, everything radiates out from and is organised around the signifier, similar to these little lines of force that an upholstery button forms on the surface of material. I've argued for a Civil War reading of Dalí's signifier Rainy Taxi. With Vilaseca, I've also argued for its implications in the construction of Dalí's identity as an artist, similar perhaps in a way to my work on Leonora Carrington, in which I've argued that her art and writing quilt the woman artist as a political subject. What struck Angela and then me in our discussion of Lacan's adoption of textile practices theory is that it's the dust in the button which is where the interest is, not just the button or its surface folds. This dusty layering of time and space which can remain hidden until looked at up close, and which might have a different meaning in different historical moments and different spaces. This is what I hope I've shared with you all tonight in my reading of Dalí's Rainy Taxi. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Such a rich and fascinating account of forms, multiplicity of forms across Dalí, Vilaseca, and many other points in between. I'm going to pass straight to Ruth for the response, and hopefully there'll be time for questions. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Can you just check you can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so thanks, James, for giving me the chance to respond to Dr. Kent's lecture. And we think we all know this event holds great intellectual and emotive significance for the department and for the Centre for Visual Cultures. It's a really good, important event for family and friends and colleagues to remember David. So in this case, I hope it's okay to use first names for you, Alicia, and also referring to David. And that's because I hold colleagues both in high esteem and very dear. So I read that an academic response is like an after-dinner mint following the main course. In this case, I'm going to be super brief to make way for questions. But above all, I want to thank you, Alicia, for your lecture and basically for providing the substantial and very interesting, carefully prepared main course. So I know that as a scholar of Hispanic studies and surrealism, you are already familiar with David's scholarly work. Even so, I think we have all been struck by the time you've taken in preparing your lecture to engage so explicitly and carefully with that work. And in doing so, you've provided a sincere and thoughtful tribute to him and his ongoing intellectual impact. That's really important, I think, to everybody in this virtual room. When Alicia submitted her lecture titled Dalís, both James and I were struck by its brevity. I think it's fair to say a one-word title is pretty refreshing for academia, in which lengthy and verbose titles and subtitles reign supreme. So who knew that you could be so concise? But in fact, the title perfectly encapsulates the multiplicity of meanings that the lecture brings out. Echoing David's work in his book, The Apocryphal Subject, it speaks to the artist's resistance to what he calls political, cultural, and psychic boundaries. It draws out rich potential for meanings in a single, albeit supremely complex artwork, underscores the different possibilities for engagements that David's work proposed, and introduces rich new interpretations by you, the speaker. Again, citing David, it advocates against the act of reducing and eliminating in favor of a single, all too clear explanation. So in your lecture, you've read Rainy Taxi at the 1938 International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris as a lost monument to the political left. You've made the case that although Dalí described himself as apolitical, and even though much critical writing has been given over to discussing the ambiguity of his alignments, and again about the resistance to his resistance to labels and isms. He said, "I did not want to be called anything but Dalí." You offer lots of examples about the power of that work and the possible interpretations of its political potency. And you do that by drawing on what he does and doesn't say about the Civil War, by looking at closely at the choices he makes with language, or more specifically languages, in order to uncover these links. And I think, like David Vilaseca, you argue that a resistance to fixed ideologies doesn't mean that Dalí has nothing to say about politics. Quite the opposite. Its existence between the crossroads of language, nation, ideology, and identity are precisely what permits him to occupy a critical and sometimes changing stance. So for Alicia, the plural readings of Dalí that David makes in the apocryphal subject open up space for new interpretations. You draw on his work to make the case for implicating Dalí himself in your reading of Rainy Taxi. You brought in his journalism and scientific interests, as well as repeated motifs. And you've worked with David's observation that the artist's work stands halfway between high art and mass culture. Your evocations of this work's sensory aspects and associations connected to the context in which it was made, I thought were especially powerful. Through breaking down Rainy Taxi into its component parts and by drawing on relevant criticism, you've argued convincingly for connections to the Civil War, ultimately reading this work as a monument. George Orwell's homage to Catalonia and his criticism of Dalí and his work have implications for your reading. You've also situated it in the context of the art and writing of the time elsewhere in the surrealist movement and the broader avant-garde. A distinct feature is your engagement with women's surrealist artists, and I found the analyses of gender identity and fashion, supported by David's close attention to these elements in the fourth chapter, Dressed to Kill, especially compelling. So I want to say a final thank you for sharing your readings of Dalí, of David's Dalí, and of your own Dalís with us tonight. Your lecture advocates for multiple perspectives and political potency. Many of us have memories of working with David on a human, interpersonal level, and your lecture reminds us how we continue to connect with him intellectually through his scholarly work that endures. So to David's family and friends, I hope this assures you that he is still very much a part of our communities.